This episode contains material that might be triggering for some. If you need to stop the podcast at any time to take care of yourself, please do so.
If you need support, you can call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 988. Dialectical behavior therapy was created in the 1980s by Marsha Linehan in Seattle, Washington.
Today, DBT is taught all over the world.
We're two therapists who believe everyone can benefit from DBT skills.
I'm Kate.
I'm Michelle.
And this is DBT and Me.
Well, hi, everybody. I'm so glad you all are here with us. Today's episode may be a little bit like the last episode we put out in the sense of I'm here solo again today without Kate, but like last time, I have another amazing guest on today that I'm really, really excited about. So I'm going to have her introduce herself in a second, but just to give you guys a sneak preview of what we're in for today with our guests, we're going to be talking about a variety of incredible DBT resources that she has. We're going to be talking about her book. We're going to be talking about her DBT podcast. We're going to be talking about workshops she has. We're going to be talking about all the amazing things that she's put together for the DBT community. And we're also going to be learning some really awesome stuff along the way about how she approaches her DBT work, and especially like interweaving Buddhism and DBT together. I've been very excited for this conversation with you, Diana. I don't know if it's coming across. I really hope it is, because when I met you and I found out all that you're offering, I really thought to myself, I was like, how have I not known this woman for years and what she's doing? So we're going to be getting into all of that. But as always, I'm going to start off with mentioning the promotional stuff like we do. Also similar to last episode. Last episode, we had some new patrons to shout out. This episode, we have some new patrons to shout out. So today, I am shouting out S. Atwood and Regina. Thank you both for becoming patrons. And if you want to become a patron, you can do so by going to the show notes. Also, patreon.com/dbtandme. It's a great way to support what we're doing on the podcast, and we appreciate each and every one of you. Another way to support the podcast is by getting stuff off of our Etsy shop. That link is also down in the show notes. It's etsy.com/shop/dbtandme. It's long. Just click on the show notes link. Much easier. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, we really appreciate any ratings and reviews you give to us. So that's a really cool way to support. And then, our favorite way to get support is if you have not gotten our book yet. That's another really awesome way to support. So the link for the book is in the show notes. You can search for it on Amazon by just searching for DBT for Everyone, and you'll find the book. And the last thing I'll mention today is that if you have any questions about this episode, or again, you need to connect with any of the things that we're going to talk about, and you're like, hold on a second, how can you get me over to Diana? I want to get to the stuff that you guys talked about. We'll be posting links as we always do in our Facebook group. You can also just send us an email at dbtmepodcast@gmail.com, and we will get you connected to any of the amazing offerings that we're going to be discussing today. So with all of that taken care of, Diana, I would love for you you're here. I'm going to turn it over to you. Give us a little brief introduction into who you are. I know that's so open-ended, but I know you'll take it and run with it.
Thank you, Michelle. I just want to say I'm really, really excited to be here. I think everything that you and Kate are doing is so amazing. Oh, too bad she's not with us today, but that's okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm Diana Partington. Dun, 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 dun. I went through DBT as a client when I was 39 years old, significantly older than that now. But I went through DBT and it really saved my life. And then I went to grad school to become a counselor and I wrote my master's thesis on effective teaching of DBT skills. I'm definitely obsessed with DBT skills. It's so much my thing, I love teaching skills. I run DBT groups I guess you and Kate used to run DBT groups.
Yes, Kate still does, but I'm no longer her co-facilitator with it.
Okay.
So yes, it
But you
continues just without me.
I know you guys were an amazing team, I'm sure. Anyway, so I run DBT groups online but in this last year, I've been on this mission to make DBT skills accessible, which is something that you guys do a great job of, and trying to look at different ways to help people access skills. So I wrote a book that came out in March, DBT for Life. It was my passion project. I spent 9 years working on it. It's full of color illustrations and short stories that illustrate use of the skill. I think, I've been trying to think about what is it that I'm doing that's different, you know what I mean, in terms of the DBT community. And one thing that I've identified is I feel like I'm good at taking people on an emotional journey. And, most of us who end up in DBT and lots of us who end up teaching DBT, we're emotionally sensitive people. We have very big feelings. And I think people who want to learn skills for managing those feelings, it's helpful to connect with feelings to do that. And so that's been a big part of sort of recognizing what it is how I'm trying to help people. And the book definitely takes people, each chapter has a short story that takes people on an emotional journey of what it's like to use skills, right? What it's like to be dealing with a really difficult problem. Like, I think sometimes people think my book might be a little bit fluffy because it's so full of color and illustrations and everything. But as you know, the stories deal with really difficult topics. So someone's dealing with very difficult situation. They're having a lot of big emotions around it. And then the story takes you through what it's like to apply skills to that situation and have a positive outcome. It's not so much that now their life is better in every way all the time, but
Right.
it's that real experience of the positive reinforcement of using skills because the outcome is better. So then other projects, like you mentioned, I also have a podcast. It's a newer podcast. And the focus of the podcast is the intersection of DBT skills and Buddhist psychology. I got really interested in this when reading Marsha Linehan's memoir, Marsha Linehan, who created DBT. She talks a lot about her journey with Buddhism. And then because I'm literally a Marsha Linehan geek, I went to the monastery where she developed her ideas about radical acceptance. So if you've ever seen Marsha Linehan in 2010 did this New York Times interview about developing DBT and her own diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. And in that interview, she talks about going to Mount Shasta Abbey in California, and she was there for like a few months, and how you had to radically accept that you would sweep a little pile and a bell would ring while you were in the middle of it. And then you had to just abandon that pile and walk away, which I thought would drive me absolutely crazy because you're like, but then people are going to tread through the pile and whatever. But that this is part of how she learned radical acceptance. And I always thought that was just the sweetest story. I love that story. And then when I went to Mount Shasta Abbey, I asked one of the nuns if she remembered when Marsha Linehan was there. And she said, "Oh, yes, she really suffered while she was here." And I just thought it was like a lightning moment for me. Oh, Marsha Linehan and radical acceptance, that wasn't cute. That was deep. And it
Yeah.
made me think about the spiritual principles behind so many of the DBT skills. And I thought, as a clinician, I've been teaching them from that sort of evidence-based, behavioral, good stuff, really, really good stuff. But I thought, there's more here. Because what Marsha Linehan really did with a lot of the skills is she took spiritual principles and then she translated them into scientific language, behavioral language, so that they'd be measurable and could be evidence-based. And she says in her memoir that she borrowed that idea from John Kabat-Zinn, who created mindfulness-based stress reduction. He was studying all these Buddhist principles at Harvard and trying to translate them into medical terminology so that you could measure the impact of practicing these practices on management of pain. And so Marsha does the same thing. And I thought, what about deconstructing that? Do you know what I mean? Like taking the behavioral scientific language and trying to deconstruct back to where does this come from? Where are these ideas coming from? and what are their original roots? Because what I like to say is that the Buddha was the first great psychologist, because
Mm-hmm.
in the Theravada Buddhism tradition, the teachings are not mystical. It's not a mystical experience. It's very much the Buddha was interested in how to reduce suffering in this life. And so, how do we reduce suffering in this life? Well, that's what psychologists are about. That's what
Yep.
health counselors are about. We're all trying to figure out, how do we help people reduce suffering? And so that's what I wanted to look at in the podcast. And so my friend Maddie, who is just awesome, she's millennial and queer and all the good things. And so, like, I'm, this sort of bohemian-y Gen Xer, really. And I love the chemistry between us. So that's really fun. And then I've got
Yeah.
workshops and trainings for therapists and just trying to do all these things, right? To
Mhm.
evangelize
Yep.
about DBT skills. We're
Yeah,
like
exactly.
DBT evangelists here, right?
Yeah. No, it's amazing. And we're going to dive into a lot of what you just talked about a little bit more. I'm actually wondering what I'm feeling called for us to dive into a little bit is your book, if you're okay
Sure.
with going
Of
there.
course.
So I want to share a little bit about Diana's book. So here's what Kay and I have said for the longest time, because we get people asking us, we're like, people say all the time, well, what DBT book do you guys recommend? And I mean, admittedly, now we'll often recommend our own book.
Of
We feel pretty
course.
proud of it. We want to
Oh,
get the word out about it.
it's very
Um,
straightforward. It's very easy to use.
oh, thank you. Yeah, that was our goal, right? To create something that felt really accessible to people who knew nothing about DBT, that felt like a good starting point that would explain the skills in an easy to understand, practical way. And that was our purpose with writing our book. Prior to our book being in the world, we always recommended, I don't know if you've recommended it also to people prior to your book being in the world, Diana, but I would always call it the light green book,
Yeah, the
right?
green
It's
book.
written
Yeah.
by, I think the first author is Jeffrey Wood. Yeah, exactly. The green book, mostly because it was the one it was the most well known and all of that. But then I found Diana's book because when we first started talking about her being a podcast guest, she was like, well, let me send you guys, my book in the mail so you can see it. You can actually know what I'm talking about. I was like, okay, great. And when it arrived, from the moment I saw the cover, I was drawn in because it's beautiful. It's beautiful art all throughout the book. Kate and I's book have, from an author to author standpoint, Diana, like our book has no illustrations, and that was intentional because we're like, this is way too much work with the publishing company to put in any kind of graphics or any kind of pictures. And your book is colorful, it's bright, it's uplifting. I opened it up and I was just like, this is the best book I have seen about DBT out there. And I'm not just saying that because you're here as a podcast guest. I'm honestly saying that because it kind of almost looks like a textbook at first. Like it's a large book. It's much larger than Kate and I's book. It's a bigger size, so it's bigger than the average book you would come across. So I was like, oh, it kind of almost seems like a textbook, but it's not, academic or jargony. It's fun. It was fun to start reading your book because I told myself, I was like, okay, she's going to be a podcast guest. I need to like skim through this a little bit and like see what it is. And then I found myself in the book for like 30 minutes and I didn't even realize it because I kept pausing to like read different things, or like there are these pages where it's like, okay, you're going to pause right now and take a breath. And I was like, all right, Michelle, actually practice what you preach. And okay, like I felt kind of like cheesy doing it in the moment, but I'm like, okay, the book has a good point. I'm always so busy in my life. Okay, I'll pause. So I did. I started pausing and breathing when the book told me to, like, as I was skimming through it. And then I was like, oh, yeah, that whole thing about how our breath is good and it helps us. And the thing I always say to my clients and that I say on the podcast, the book actually encouraged me to do it. And I listened. And the stories they do such a great job of illustrating how DBT looks in real life, which is, again, a thing that Kate and I are all about. It's not just about knowing skills, it's about knowing how to actually apply them when you're encountering stressful situations. And you have a story about that for every single skill. I mean,
Well, the major skill,
honestly, you
the
guys.
major skills.
I mean, but a lot of them, right? Like there's a lot of skills in here this book, I cannot recommend it enough. This book is amazing. So, like Diana was saying, yeah, you can order it off of Amazon, but we'll make sure to be posting a link in the Facebook group. So, I'm telling you, if you are sitting here listening to this right now and you don't have a book about DBT in your life, but you've been curious about, like, well, where could I start if I wanted to actually read something about DBT, especially for those of you out there that I know are self-taught and you're not working with a therapist around DBT, you're not in a DBT group, you're just trying to teach yourself and learn as much as you can, you want Diana's book.
I
I'm
think
dead serious.
even if you're not a reader, that's one. So I'm dyslexic. I was like, don't worry, I had proofreaders and copy editors and all that. But
Yeah.
I'm dyslexic, and for me, a lot of self-help books are really challenging because it's such dense text and it's so conceptual.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to create a DBT book that was going to be for non-readers also. So I know for me, I learn from a story better. It's easier for me to engage with a story than
Yeah.
didactic kind of text. And so that's why the stories are there, but also it's very, very visual. So, you can kind of skim and look at graphics and things like that to try and comprehend and understand skills. The other thing that it was really important to me about the book is that you don't have to read it cover to cover.
Yeah.
So there's an idea in Japanese psychology called Kaizen. And the idea of Kaizen is to be able to tiptoe around your amygdala. So I don't know how many people out there, when you're like, oh, I got to read this whole self-help book. Oh, it's just a lot. And then your amygdala, the fight flight part of your brain goes, I can't start it. I can't read this book. It's too much. It's too much. I wanted to create a book that literally you can flip it open and be like, oh, I like this illustration. I'm going to read this page. Which for your amygdala, it doesn't notice. It's not like, it's like, oh, that's no big deal. There's nothing scary about that. There's nothing scary about picking an illustration that you like, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then maybe you like an illustration and you see that the story across from the illustration looks interesting. And then you could just read that. Right?
Yeah.
And then there's people who they don't care about the stories. They just want to read the didactic part and the ideas for practice. I wanted there to just be so many different ways to engage with the book that people of all kinds of different learning styles would be able to find themselves in the book.
Yeah. And that really comes across.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yep. So I'm wondering if you're open to it, because I know this is the thing we talked about when we first met you. And Diana encouraged us. So I went back to the book again, right? I went through it kind of initially, like I was telling you guys. I was like, oh, I'll skim this real quickly. And then I was there for longer than I planned to be in a really good way. But when I went back to it, to choose, okay, what's an excerpt for Diana to read to all of you so you can get an idea of what her book is about. And again, one of the things that I always come back to, I feel like over and over and over again with DBT, is how do we talk about radical acceptance? How do we make radical acceptance something that people really grasp what we're talking about, and that they actually can see themselves working through radical acceptance about something in their own life, which oftentimes is incredibly difficult to do. And so I picked for Diana to read the radical acceptance story. So Diana, are you okay if we just jump into that? If you just want to read it aloud for our listeners here, so then they can hear a little bit of this.
Like, it's true. My editor, I did so many rounds of edits on this book, and one of the first rounds, she was like, I don't understand what radical acceptance is. So we worked so hard on how in the story do we convey it? How do we explain it, in the explanation section of the book? So that, because I feel like there's something about radical acceptance that is a body sensation.
You feel it when you find it.
You feel it when you find it. That's exactly it. Oh, we should get a bumper sticker. That could be merch on the Etsy site. You feel it when you feel it when you find it.
Yeah, it's not a bad idea.
I do have sensitive content warnings.
Mhm.
And the sensitive content warning for this story does involve a woman and her cat narrowly escaping an apartment fire. So for anyone who has, house fire kind of trauma, I just wanted to give them a heads up about that
Yeah, that's great.
because it is a little bit dramatic. So here we go. Here's my dramatic
Yeah.
read. The story is called Quiet, a story about radical acceptance. Charlie tugged at Jenny's skin with his sharp little teeth. Quit it! She pushed her marmalade tomcat away without opening her eyes. I'm sleeping. He headbutted her hand, meowing and nipping at her again. She rubbed his head, which usually ignited a generous purr. Instead, he moved to her face and nibbled her cheek, patting her nose with his paw. What are you doing? Jenny opened her eyes, coughing. Oh, shit. Thick gray clouds of smoke hovered below the ceiling. The room was suddenly very hot. Jenny grabbed Charlie and leapt out of bed, screaming for her roommate. Amy! Amy, wake up, it's a fire! Just as she was leaving her bedroom, the ceiling crumbled behind her, launching flames into the room. She ran. Blisters formed on the back of her calves as the fire raced across the synthetic carpet and licked at her ankles. Amy was screaming. They met at the door of the apartment and bolted into the hallway. They slammed the door behind them, running down the dark hall towards the illuminated exit signs, keeping their heads below the smoke. Other tenants were swarming the stairwell. Someone pushed Jenny and she almost dropped Charlie, but the cat clung to her, his claws gripping her skin. Then they were outside, running across the parking lot as the windows exploded and the entire building erupted into flame. When she looked back, a wall of orange had swallowed everything. Fire trucks arrived right as the whole apartment building collapsed. The firefighters didn't even try to put out the fire. They just tried to keep it from spreading, while EMTs were helping injured people. At the far end of the parking lot, Jenny sat on the asphalt, trying not to pass out. Loose gravel cut her burns, and she sobbed from the pain. She squeezed Charlie, who was curled into a tight ball in her arms. If she fainted, she might lose him. An EMT covered her with a blanket, then gave her a canister of oxygen to breathe, tending to the burns on the backs of Jenny's legs and feet. You're lucky, she said. These aren't too bad. She stared at the woman. She didn't feel lucky. Jenny couldn't stop coughing. Her feet were bleeding from running across the gravel. Her legs throbbed with pain. I must have stepped on something sharp. You should go to the ER and have a doctor look at these. We can take you, but you can't bring the cat. She looked at the EMT, incredulous. I'm not leaving my cat. He saved my life. A volunteer appeared with a cat carrier and slippers for her feet. It was such a relief to put Charlie in the carrier. He dug his little claws into her hands, not wanting to leave the safety of her embrace. Oh, sweet kitty, this will be better, I promise. As she closed the carrier door, he yowled in protest. The volunteer asked, Is there anyone I can call for you? Where was her phone? She panicked, patting her pocketless pajamas and looking around her as though she might have set it down somewhere nearby. Then she screamed, No, no, where's my cell phone? She remembered thinking about it when she saw the smoke. She remembered seeing it, but then the flames. I don't know anyone's phone number. I don't know who you can call, she yelled at the volunteer through her tears. Amy touched her arm. I have my phone. I'll call your parents. My mom's already on her way. Jenny stared at her roommate. Why was it so hard to focus on anything? The air smelled like burning hair and plastic. Amy had bandages on her arms and legs. When did that happen? Amy, thank you. I want to call my mom. Where did the time go? 5 days of doctor visits, insurance calls, sleeping, then being afraid to sleep, nightmares, depending on her mother for everything, well-meaning friends and family dropping off odd donations. Why did anyone think she would need soccer cleats after the fire? She hadn't played soccer since high school. Jenny was terrified of being separated from Charlie. She packed him in her carrier and took him everywhere. People just had to deal with it. When she had a free hour to see her therapist, her mom drove Jenny and Charlie to the office. Jenny settled into the couch, letting Charlie out of his carrier and pulling him onto her lap. She said, I see you put a box of tissues right on the couch. Are you hoping I'm going to cry? You know I don't like crying in front of people. Her therapist smiled. Not hoping for tears, just want you to know it's okay to cry. I mean, this is therapy and you're dealing with significant trauma. How are your burns? The burns hurt, but they're getting better. Jenny buried her face in Charlie's fur, kissing him. And she said, "Thanks for being cool about Charlie. I just get so scared of something happening to him if I'm not there. Sometimes in my nightmares, Charlie dies in that fire." Saying those words aloud, she fought back a surge of tears. "Don't make me cry. I promise I won't try to make you cry. And if the tears come, you don't have to hold them back." Jenny looked at her therapist and wondered what it would be like if she just completely lost it. How would either of them handle it? "I feel like I'm in hell." She told her therapist how she kept reliving the fire in her dreams. In some dreams, Charlie died. In others, she was burned alive. "You know, he saved my life." She pulled Charlie off her lap and into her arms, cradling him like a baby. He reached up and nudged her face with his. "In some of the dreams, I try to scream and wake up Amy. I try and try, but no sound comes out. I keep waking up thinking that Amy's dead, and it feels too real." Jenny looked out the window. She told the therapist about the sound of the windows exploding. "Even seeing a window seems to freak me out. It's unpredictable." She hated the sneakers her mom had loaned her. She only had one pair of underpants. "I know it's gross. I keep meaning to get more, but I don't have my car. The dealership was taking forever to get her a new key fob. I got a new iPhone, but now I have to DM people or wait for them to call me because I don't have anyone's phone number. Of course, I listened to my dad and didn't store anything in the cloud. I snapped at him yesterday. I said, 'Dad, there is no privacy anymore. Privacy's dead.'" Jenny sighed. "I'm trying to use my DBT skills. I'm trying to use radical acceptance. But there are so many things that are hard to accept, like these stupid burns. They hurt, and I'm worried about scarring." She shifted on the couch, trying to get comfortable so nothing was touching the backs of her calves. Her therapist nodded. "You've been through so much, Jenny, and it's all so recent. Is turning your mind towards acceptance helping? Do you remember that children's book, Goodnight Moon, where the little boy says goodnight to everything in his room before he goes to sleep, like he's letting go of the day?" Jenny asked. "Yes, my kids love that book," the therapist smiled. "It's such a quiet book, you know? I think radical acceptance for me feels like that. This is me saying goodbye to everything I lost in the fire. Good night, phone. Good night, keys. Good night, laptop. Goodbye, skirt that I got in Belize." Charlie looked up at Jenny and blinked. She blinked back. "Did you know that when a cat blinks at you, he's sending you kisses? I have tried blinking at my cat. I know that little guy loves me, but he just gives me this, 'oh, please' look." Her therapist tried blinking at Charlie. He looked at her and blinked back. Charlie is much more generous. That cat really loves you." Jenny explained how losing a phone is more than phone numbers. It's like losing all your photo albums, except things she'd posted on social media. She kind of wished she hadn't dropped off social media last year. At the time, it seemed like the best thing for my mental health, but now I don't have the photos I took last year. I'm trying to accept that. Jenny sat quietly for a moment. She touched Charlie's nose with her nose, then looked up. "Goodbye, memories. Goodbye, Chagall. Have you heard of the painter Marc Chagall? I had a framed sketch that I inherited from my grandmother. She posed for him in the 60s. The sketch is irreplaceable." "Your grandmother modeled for Chagall?" Jenny laughed. "My grandmother was the most glamorous person I ever met." "That sketch must have meant a lot to you." "Yeah, when I say goodbye, Chagall, I get this feeling of acceptance. Like I'm acknowledging the importance of the thing and then letting it go. These are significant losses, Jenny. That's a lot to accept." "It's amazing no one died." Jenny paused to breathe. "Okay, my chest is clenching up." She started to cough. "I'm going to try and just breathe. All the smoke from the fire is still messing me up." They sat together just breathing for a few minutes. When her body finally relaxed, Jenny spoke again. "You know how you taught me about turning the mind? You said you can radically accept something and then sort of unaccept it, go back to fighting reality. I literally feel myself going back and forth between completely accepting the fire and everything about it, to totally unaccepting it. Why me? Why does this stuff always happen to me? And then having to turn my mind back to acceptance. Isn't that weird? I don't think it's weird at all, said the therapist. I think you're describing exactly what radical acceptance is. It's not an epiphany where the heavens part and you're completely transformed. It doesn't mean suddenly everything is fine and dandy. Sometimes we slip back into the pain of no, I don't want this to be reality. Make this not be reality. I don't like it. And when that happens, we acknowledge the willfulness and then gently turn back to acceptance because acceptance is less painful. Her therapist had slipped into teaching mode. I'm sorry, Jenny. I didn't mean to lecture you. You already know all of this. Yeah, I remember. But it's good to hear it again. Like you say, pain happens. Suffering's optional. Just to be clear, the idea isn't to minimize the real experience of your pain. The pain from these burns and cuts, the incredible pain of your losses, the fear and nightmares. All of that pain needs comfort and attention and compassion. The idea of radical acceptance is that you're not piling suffering on top of that pain because you aren't fighting reality. It's important that we validate those losses. I still wish it didn't happen. For the past 5 days, Jenny tried again and again to turn her mind towards accepting her current reality. When I finally make it to the store to buy some sexy underwear, that will be a major step in reality acceptance. Do you have any idea what it's like to try and rebuild your lingerie collection? I can imagine. For a moment, it felt like they both might laugh because of the absurdity and importance of it all. I loved my clothes. All my cute outfits are gone. It sucks. Charlie wriggled out of her arms and moved to the other side of the couch, sniffing everything. Then he jumped up and settled on the side table by the window, chattering at a bird on a branch outside. And here I go again, unaccepting reality, because it makes me mad that my neighbors had a candle mishap and I lost everything. She looks down at her feet. I can't tell you how much I hate these squeaky sneakers. Oh, Jenny, you are working so hard to accept so many losses. You know, it was 6 months ago that I tried to kill myself. That's not long at all. And you have grown so much, her therapist validated. Jenny started to cry. Oh, now tears. I guess it's good to let myself feel the grief. A year ago, she would have been so full of rage and blame, angry at everyone else and calling herself a loser. Yes, she was irritable, but her feelings were manageable. A year ago, I might have assaulted my landlord or something worse. I'm furious with him. Not one of the fire alarms on our side of the building went off. Not one. It's literally criminal. And yet, here I am. I haven't considered killing myself or anyone else at all, not once. During the fire, once I was in the parking lot, I did yell at a volunteer, Jenny sighed. It was like a glimpse of my old unskillful self. It felt like a little slip, but I'm actually really proud of myself. Snapping at that volunteer is the worst thing I did during this entire disaster. I really am a completely different person. I could not have handled any of this without skills.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for giving me a chance to share that story.
Yeah. When Kate and I released our book, we did a podcast episode where we read excerpts of the book. And so I think it gives people like a little.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It gives people a good window, just a little segue from like podcasting to like, let's take a break for like
Story
an
time.
audiobook. So the thing that I didn't share with you, Diana, part of what intrigued me actually about this story, and I appreciated you naming verbally kind of the trigger warning before diving into this, is that my husband was significantly burned as a child when he was 6 years old in a house fire. And so when I saw that you had included part in your book, I mean to say, telling the story of somebody who had been through a house fire experience, I was really intrigued. And when I saw it was the radical acceptance story, I was like, well, we can always talk more about radical acceptance. But, you know, you did such a good job in this story, I think, of normalizing the challenge of radical acceptance. And just to go back to it, I love the part where it's like radical acceptance is not an epiphany where the heavens part and you're completely transformed. It doesn't mean suddenly everything is fine and dandy. sometimes we slip back into the pain of, no, I don't want this to be reality. Right. But it also says, make this not be reality. I don't like it. But when that happens, we acknowledge that is willfulness and gently turn back to acceptance, because acceptance is less painful. Like, that part really stood out to me. But what I hope our listeners take away from hearing you read this story is that, like you said, when you were talking a little bit about the book itself, is just like, you want this to not just be like, this is what a skill is and this is what you do, right? Stories, they tap into a different part of our brain and really help us, I think, have it feel like we're not necessarily, I mean, of course we are learning, but it doesn't
Yeah.
feel like that more like academic kind of learning
Yeah,
that people
exactly.
feel a
Exactly.
lot, I think, when they're exploring DBT. It is in many ways so academic, but I mean,
Exactly.
I'm gonna remember that whole thing about, yep, goodbye phone, goodbye this. I'm like, yeah,
Isn't that really what it feels like, though? It does feel like
yeah.
that to me. So I was going through DBT when my kids were little. I remember that there's a quietness to radical acceptance, right? And
Mm-hmm.
there's that book, Goodnight Moon, is very quiet.
Mm-hmm.
It's really the story of a little child letting go of the day. You
Yeah.
know, how it's so hard for little kids to let go, radically accept that it's bedtime, let
Yep.
go of the day. So it's the like, okay, good night to this and good night to that and good night to that. And I feel like radical acceptance, when you sort of are really in that deep felt sense of it, especially when it's something
Mm-hmm.
important to you,
Yeah.
it has that quietness to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. No, it does. Yeah. I'm wondering, switching gears a little bit, but this is something I really want you to share with our listeners and for them to learn more about. Obviously, Kate and I, we've been doing this podcast now for a long time, but over the years of doing the podcast and things that have come up in our lives and everything, we release an episode once a month, and if we're lucky, we release, one or two smaller Q&A episodes. But your podcast is just launching, and I really feel like what you're offering could be great for our listeners who have gone through all of our episodes and they want more DBT in their lives. And so I'm wondering a couple things. I guess this is a multi-part question. One, what inspired you to start your podcast? And two, can you tell everyone some of what it's about and the Buddhist piece that you weave into this? Because that's what I'm here for, learning more about the intersection of Buddhism and DBT. So I just want to hear about all of the things pertaining to your podcast, because I think it's a great thing to be getting out there.
There is really a little bit of a story. I used to teach DBT at a treatment center that also had a mindfulness instructor, and sometimes he would co-facilitate my DBT group with me. And so we would get into these like great discussions of DBT skills and tools from Buddhist psychology. And he was the one who actually pitched me on the podcast years ago. And then he went and
Oh.
had children and like was too busy to do it with me. And so I'd had this sort of in the back of my mind for ages. And then I felt like with the book coming out and really trying to create a company that's about making DBT skills accessible, I feel like
Mhm.
a podcast is such a great vehicle for teaching, as you know. And I know that there are like podcasts like yours that do a great job teaching skills. So I didn't need to do that. Do you know what I mean?
Yep. Yep.
But I feel like in a lot of the way that sometimes DBT skills can be very inaccessible in some ways, I feel like Buddhist psychology is kind of like that too. It's like there's just a lot of concepts. It's a little hard to figure out how to access it. And so ultimately, I have a friend who is a Dharma facilitator, Maddie, and I asked her if she would do this with me. And we have had so much fun having conversations about DBT and the Dharma. The Dharma is the teachings of the Buddha.
Mhm.
And originally we named the podcast DBT and the Dharma, but then my marketing people were like, that's too limited. So we named it Suffering Optional, where
Mhm.
DBT meets the Dharma. And so what we're doing is we're actually going through the chapters in my book. And that's sort of the format for how we're structuring the episodes. So the first episode is an introduction to DBT and an introduction to the Dharma. And then the second episode was about mindfulness as a practice. And one thing that I want to share with your people, because everyone who's done DBT knows about mindfulness. Yay, mindfulness. But one of the things that I learned from Maddie in doing the podcast was the idea of an anchor. Have you talked about this with your clients?
No, please share about this. Yes, because I don't know much either. Talk about it. Yes.
So good. So the idea of an anchor is that whenever you're doing mindfulness, you identify an anchor that is what your mind is returning to. So, right. So we talk about mindfulness. We're like, okay, mindfulness of breath, right? Mindful eating, mindfulness of what you're eating. Maybe you have a mantra or something specific that you want to be like words that you want to focus on. Every time you pick something that you want to train your attention to, that is the anchor. Does that make sense? So, a lot what Marsha Linehan says, she doesn't teach meditation as part of DBT because a lot of people dissociate when they are trying to focus on their breath. Well, if that's your problem, like if that's a thing that makes it really hard for you to practice mindfulness, you just identify a different anchor. So like, I know your people can't see him, but this is my
Kitty.
Yes. And Beans is a great anchor for me. When I want to practice mindfulness and train my attention, I just focus on him. He's the anchor. Does that make sense? But when you realize that like anything can be the anchor for your mindfulness practice, it's like, so with my cat, right? Here's my cat. He's got this cute little face. Looks like he's wearing white eyeliner. And if I'm just looking at his little face and patting him, and then my mind wanders to, oh my gosh, what about this project? What's going wrong? Blah, 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 or what's going on with my kid, or what's going on, what all the things. And when you're like, okay, one mindfully, DBT skill, right? I want to be able to focus on one thing at a time. I don't want to be worrying while I'm out to dinner with my friend. I don't want to be obsessing or ruminating about this other thing when I'm trying to work, right? I always think one of the great privileges of being a therapist is we have to do mindfulness practice in session.
That's very true. Otherwise, we're not doing a very good job.
Exactly. Like you can't really do therapy if you're not completely focused on your client in the session, right? Which is great mindfulness practice. The client is the anchor for the therapist in the session, right? So the anchor could be, your meal. The anchor could be driving. Your anchor could be the tree outside your window. I don't know. There was something about like understanding that I had always known like, oh, mindfulness practice. You can practice mindful walking. You can practice this. You can practice, but recognizing that you can identify anything as your anchor. I found that quite powerful for how I think about mindfulness as a practice.
Yeah.
So that's a little tidbit from episode 2 of Suffering Optional. Another one, like it's been so interesting because when I was learning DBT skills as a client, it was so revolutionary for me to be able to like address my pain with skills, right? To bring skills in and address pain with them was a huge relief to have this toolbox. And I feel like going through this process with Maddie, where I'm talking about the DBT skills, teaching them to her, teaching them to the audience. And then Maddie is talking about tools from Buddhist psychology. There was one time where we were so I'm going to give you a little lesson from Buddhist psychology. It's
Please do. I'm really excited.
Okay. So this is from the Theravada Buddhist tradition, which is different than like the Tibetan tradition or the I can't remember the name of the other one. Anyway, enlightenment. This idea of enlightenment, what it means is so Pali Sanskrit is the language that theoretically was spoken at the time of the Buddha. And so the Pali word for enlightenment is nibbana, Nibbana. And nibbana actually comes from a cooking term. And the cooking term is to remove the boiling pot of water from the flames so that it cools down. That's nibbana. So enlightenment is the ability to get off of the flames and kind of cool down. And what are the 3 flames in Buddhism? They're the flames of greed, hatred, and delusion. Greed is wanting what I don't have. Hatred is not wanting what is, and delusion is not wanting to be here, like checking out. And when you can remove your psyche, when you can remove your mind from those three things, from the endless wanting of things we don't have, the endless lament about things we don't want to have be the way they are, and like the hatred of those things, the despair of those things, and then and I feel like it's so important for a lot of people who are drawn to DBT, obviously, are struggle with suicidality. And that's part of that delusion of like not wanting to be, right? And just the metaphor of that, Marshall Linehan loves metaphors, the metaphor of like just seeing yourself as the rolling boil in that pot of water, right? And the ability to just literally remove yourself from the flames of not wanting, and not wanting to be. I was having a dark night of the soul late at night one night, and I was in quite the lament and in a lot of pain. And then I thought, oh, I'm in the rolling boil. I'm like, I've cranked up the flames on the three flames, and I'm just in it. And I thought, I'm going to turn off the flames and take the pot of water and put it with it. And that to me is like one of the things that I love about mindfulness and DBT is I think that all of the skills are about helping you be mindful and helping you get to your wise mind, right?
Yeah.
Like clarifying priorities. What is that? Like you're being mindful of what's most important to you. Is it relationship? Is it self-respect? Or is it objective? That's mindfulness, right? Check the facts skill. That's mindfulness. I mean, it's mindfulness meets cognitive behavioral therapy, but it is
Right.
right of what am I interpreting here? Opposite action, mindfulness of your action urge. It's all mindfulness, right? And it gives us that separation, that ability to step back and not be in the boiling pot of water, but to recognize that you actually can change how you're responding to the situation and take yourself off of the flames. So I love the bringing that Buddhist psychology stuff in because I feel like it does the same thing. It has that way of like helping us step into that role of the observer of our experience and allow us to make choices about how much suffering we want to pile on to what is already a very painful life. So this is another thing from Buddhism that I actually included in my book. It's the two arrows of pain and suffering. Okay. This is very good for DBT. So pain is inevitable. If you're going to be alive, you're going to experience pain. The Buddha said the thing with life is there's always going to be death, decrepitude, and disease. The thing that you ever loved, you will lose because it will die, you will, and you will not get everything that you want in this life. And if you can radically accept all of those things, life becomes much less painful, like much less suffering. So the distinction here is pain is the stuff that just comes with life. Suffering is how we respond to that pain and add more suffering to that pain. And I think that all the skills in DBT are about responding to that pain in ways that don't increase your suffering.
Yeah.
And that is true for all the tools from Buddhism as well. And so the two arrows it's a fun fable from Buddhism. So if you imagine someone is walking through the woods and then out of nowhere they get shot with an arrow. That arrow is very painful, right? I mean, you're shot with an arrow. That's not your imagination. That's not you overreacting. You know what I mean? That's like, no, the pain of that arrow is very real and very dangerous. The suffering comes when you pick up a second arrow and start stabbing yourself with it. And that second arrow is, why does this always happen to me? What's wrong with me? I must be such a loser. I must be because this thing happened to me. And I think, in radical acceptance terms, we don't pick up the second arrow. We're just like, okay, I have an arrow in my leg. What do I need to do about that? Do you know what I mean? Like, okay, this is real. This is painful. How am I going to get help? How am I going to address the wound? That's radical acceptance, right? This has happened. How am I dealing with it? The fighting reality is, I can't believe this is happening to me. Why does this always happen to me? Those are the thoughts that create immense suffering on top of this chance happening that you got shot with the arrow. So we talk about the two arrows of pain and suffering. The first arrow is just the pain that comes with life. The second arrow is the arrow that we pick up and start hurting ourselves with because we're adding suffering on top of that real pain. And so really all of our DBT skills are to stop the second arrow.
Yeah.
That's a
Oh,
little
this is this is amazing. I'm just sitting here because I didn't know any of this. I know very little about Buddhism, but I'm like taking notes on my phone. I'm like, okay, this is amazing what you're talking about. And I know you're just giving us a little taste,
Yeah.
like you said, oh, these are some things that, came up in some of the podcast episodes you've already put out. But I am so intrigued. Like
Isn't it? It's like a
yeah,
whole
it's
other
fascinating.
toolkit, but it's
Mhm.
so intertwined with what we do in DBT, which is
Yeah.
makes it so incredibly exciting to me.
Yeah. No, I love that we're talking so much about radical acceptance. I knew we would a little bit because I knew that was the book excerpt I had chosen for you to read aloud. But wow, the next time I find myself talking about radical acceptance with a client, I'm going to be talking about
The
some of
two
these things.
arrows,
Yep, the
right?
two arrows. Yeah,
Well, like I think
exactly.
in my book, the introduction to the distress tolerance unit, I talk about the two arrows
Mhm.
because I think distress tolerance skills are all about stopping the second arrow.
Oh yeah, 100%. Yep. We say all the time, like when Kate and I would lead groups and we would, give a brief summary of what each of the modules are about. We always say for distress tolerance in particular, I know that kind of at its base, it's just about, okay, when you're feeling, stressed, what do you do about it? But we've always presented it to clients as distress tolerance skills are there for when events happen in your life that are outside of your control, right?
Mhm.
Distress tolerance is there for, yep, when someone you love has died. Distress tolerance
Yep.
is there for if you, yep, I mean, anything really pertaining to grief. You've lost your job. You were in a terrible car accident. Like, it's
Anything
anything
that you
that's,
didn't want to have happen.
yeah, that's why, again, the story is so great with the apartment fire. That's a perfect distress tolerance situation. So, the things that occur in life where, yep, didn't ask for it, came out of the blue, and yep, the things that do that cause us pain, but it's exactly what you're talking about. It really is all about how can I recognize that, okay, I have this arrow in my leg, and yep, not make it worse. All of that. And the three flames you mentioned too, those really stood out to me of, okay, how can I notice when I'm experiencing any or all of those three
Of those
things?
findings. Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
and that when we get to a place of radical acceptance, it does. I love the imagery. I'm a big visual person. So
Mhm.
really imagining that pot coming off
Off of the
of the
flame.
stove. Yeah, it's
Mhm.
powerful.
So powerful.
Really.
And I
Yeah.
love it. To me, it's so much like DBT is that like I didn't invent this stuff. Do you know what I mean? But oh my God, it's so exciting to share it with other people. It's
Mm-hmm.
so exciting to like learn about these things and then find ways to share them and teach them to other people. That's the real excitement about the Suffering Optional podcast for me
Mm-hmm.
is that. And I love kind of having that be like the next gen of the with the book that it works with
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, you learned about radical acceptance, let's go deeper.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. And I know you and I we were touching a little bit on this, before we actually started recording the episode today, but hearing you just share a little bit of those tidbits about some Buddhist concepts, I really see exactly what you're talking about. And it really does seem to make a lot of sense that, yeah, once, if you're listening to this and you're like, okay, you know what? Guess what, guys? I know the DBT skills. I do. I know all of what accept stands for. Like, yeah, exactly. I know the acronyms. I've gone through a group, at least two times. Like, I know DBT really well. And even if you're at this point where you're like, and I'm practicing skills regularly in my life, I mean, that's what we hope for, right? And also, I'm with you. I think adding in these new Buddhist perspectives of what DBT teaches, that really would help deepen
Really,
the work, because, we talk about this too sometimes, Kate and I, of like, you can start using skills from like a conscious perspective, which is a lot of times what I recommend for beginners. Like, have a situation where you're like, okay, I need to sit down and do a check the facts worksheet for this situation, right? Like,
I need
there's
to
definitely
write out a deer.
yep, I need a dear manuscript. Exactly, right? Like, I am really choosing a skill and I'm saying, okay, I want to use this skill for this situation in my life. And that's amazing. That's a great place to begin. And then hopefully that evolves into where you recognize, okay, I'm not necessarily like consciously hand picking skills. I just find myself kind of acting more skillfully in my
Yes.
life, and things that used to explode now aren't exploding anymore. And then I reflect on it afterwards and I'm like, oh, well, you know what? I
That
was
was
actually
pretty
using some opposite
skillful.
action there. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Like, oh, I wasn't consciously choosing the skills. I was just doing them. But then I almost feel like, yeah, like you're adding in this third layer there, which is like, no, as I just move through the world, my outlook of how I exist. Not
Yes.
just like, the decisions that I'm making in the moment are skillful
But like
decisions, but like,
my understanding of
yeah.
life, my understanding
Yes, yeah,
of life.
perfect.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah. I reached this place where just, yeah, my understanding of life, my outlook on things, the way that I interpret situations, I'm just able to be more, I guess, clear. I mean, more wise mind, like we were saying, wise mind is at the
Yeah.
root of everything.
Wise mind,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. I'm just more clear. I'm just, I don't
That
know, just
Maddie
peaceful.
talks about in this first episode, she talks about Buddha nature, which is
Hmm.
such a correlate for wise mind. Buddha nature is when you are your true wise self. Like your real, like in IFS, in internal family systems, they would call it your essential self.
Okay.
It's the truly true goodness part of you. It's
Mm.
part of you that it can see clearly to act wisely. It's
Mm-hmm.
and so all of the tools in Buddhism are meant to help you access your Buddha nature. And all of the tools in DBT are meant to help you access your wise mind.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense when you talk about what that is. Yeah. Amazing. I wanted to hear, switching gears again. One of the things that I also loved about you when I, found out who you were and what you were doing, and I checked out your website, is that you have a ton of great offerings for people. I mean, low cost, like webinar offerings that I think, again, are such a great way to make DBT accessible. And, we talked about this with the last guest that we had on. Kay and I really want to be mindful of who we are having on the podcast, because we really only want to be talking about and endorsing people where we're like, okay, you've got good stuff out there. Like, this is the stuff that our listeners would really want, would really benefit from, especially when we have listeners who, the reason why they're here listening to this podcast is because they don't have a lot of access to other DBT stuff. So obviously, I know we don't have the time or the space to go into all of the webinars, but if you had to, I don't know, like pick one or maybe two that, like, the ones that you really are like, I love this
They're
one
jazzed
in
about,
particular, your
you know.
favorite one, what would it be to tell people about?
That's well, the one that's sort of obvious to talk about is the ones that I'm doing in November, since when you're releasing the podcast. The ones that are coming up, there's the holiday survival skills.
Ooh,
So
love
what I'm trying to do with these online workshops is kind of say, okay, what are the skills that are helpful for this situation?
that.
And then teach those skills. And it's very different than DBT group, right? DBT group, we're going systematically through the book, we're learning
Yeah.
all the skills. This is more like, okay, you're heading into Thanksgiving, you're heading into Christmas, you're going to be around your family tends to trigger the crap out of you. So
Mm-hmm.
what do you want to walk into those situations? What skills do you want to be armed with? And then come to the workshop and I'm going to teach you those skills. I'm going to teach you the cope ahead skill. I'm going to teach you the stop skill. I'm trying to think what else. What else? There, I have a bundle of 4 skills that I'm going to teach in that workshop that are meant to prepare you so you can walk in and you can be like, okay, I've got my little toolkit. I'm ready. I'm ready for my creepy uncle. I'm ready for my obnoxious dad. I'm ready for my meddling mother. You know what I mean? Sorry, I'm just trading in cliches here, but that you walk in and you sort of feel prepared, which can also really help with any kind of triggering situations. When you feel prepared for them, when you feel like you've got a few DBT ninja stars in your pocket and you can handle that. So I've got 2 sessions of the DBT holiday survival skills. I've got one that's happening on November 2nd and another one that's happening on November 19th. So those are
awesome. We will be posting links in the Facebook group.
Absolutely. The other one is on Saturday, November 23rd. I think probably this is going to be too basic for a lot of your listeners. I have a free workshop that I offer every 6 weeks called DBT Curious. And so if you have if you're out there in the world and you're like, I know a lot about DBT, but my mother knows nothing.
That's what I was just thinking. Who are your loved ones, everybody?
The journey that I'm on, right? You could send her to the DBT Curious workshop.
Nice.
Does that make sense? And that's on November 3rd. Or your boyfriend or your partner or whatever. You know what I mean? If there's some people in your world where you are all about DBT and they don't understand it, or, we all have that friend that you're like, oh my gosh, you really need DBT.
Yes, we all do have that friend. Yeah.
And they're like, I don't know, it's too expensive, blah, 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 whatever. You can send them to the DBT Curious workshop. So those are 2. The other one I'm going to offer again in the winter is one thing that I think is so odd about Marsha Linehan is so many of our clients, so many emotionally sensitive people, romantic relationships are like one of the hardest things to navigate.
Yep.
Because all of the intense emotions that come up, all of the attachment wounds, all of that. And it surprises me that Marsha Linehan doesn't really directly address romantic relationships.
That's true.
I mean, she talks about interpersonal skills, but she doesn't talk about the things that specifically come up in romantic relationships. So I did develop a workshop called the Wise Mind Dating Workshop. It's about applying DBT skills to dating specifically. So that's another little one.
Nice.
Yeah. So
those are all really, really great.
My website is dbtforlife.com.
Yep, DBT for life.
All my things are on there.
Yeah, and we'll post some of those specific links too for the ones you just mentioned. So then it's really easy for people to find and get registered and signed up for that stuff. Yeah, and I love, with the DBT Curious one, if I really highlight that for a second, because I know people tell us all the time, like people will post in the Facebook group. I saw something just a couple days ago where someone was like, yeah, and then I told my boyfriend about DBT and now they listen to you and, thank you. Cool. Right? Like, first of all, thank you for all of you out there who have told somebody in your life about our podcast. And also, I know that some people love podcasts, and this would be above and beyond their preferred modality to learn about anything is to find a podcast about it. And then other people, right? It's a book. Or for other people, it's like, okay, I don't have time to read. I don't really do this podcast thing, but if you're asking me to show up to a webinar for like an hour and there's going to be like a bunch of information packed in or what have you, then that's their jam. So I think this is just a general principle. Whenever you want to introduce anybody to anything that you care about and you want them to get on board,
what's their learning route? How do they like to learn? Exactly.
Yes. How do they like to learn? And I just feel like the webinar is a really great option because even though, yes, I mean, a podcast is also free and a great way to get information and all of that. I also know that, podcasts are not for everybody. Yeah. And that's why, again, we really wanted you on as a guest because you check all the boxes. We're like, okay, book, check. Your own podcast, check. Webinars, check. Like to just get a lot of resources out there that people otherwise might not.
I have one other resource
Oh,
that
yeah.
a couple things I wanted to share about it. So I do something called the DBT Insider. So every
Mhm.
time, so I run my DBT groups run on Wednesdays. And what I do is I take the transcripts from those groups and then I put together a newsletter that teaches what we taught in group. So my thought with this is people who can't afford group, but really want to do sort of self-guided study of DBT skills, they can subscribe to the DBT Insider. Really low cost subscription. You get the DBT Insider every week with graphics and little articles, and it's very easy, bite-sized, digestible things.
Yeah.
I have a former client who, so we're making a bundle for Christmas, okay? And my former client, what she told me, this is what gave me the idea, is she said, she had gone through DBT and she really felt like it was actually alienating her from her family because she's working in with all these skills and they just don't speak that language. And she felt really disconnected from them. And then her brother got into DBT in a treatment program. And her mom came to her and said, okay, I want to understand about this DBT stuff. So what they did is they started a family book group. I just love
Oh,
this. They started a family book group. And she said, what she does is whatever the issue is that's going on in their family, she'll assign them a chapter to read from my book, or she'll forward them one of the newsletters, one of the
mm.
DBT Insider, and be like, okay, read this, watch this video, whatever. And then we'll talk about that. And they do that every week.
That's amazing. That's super cool.
I just think that is like the sweetest thing ever. And I thought,
Yeah.
again, it's that thing of like when, especially for like your audience, because it just feels to me like so much of your audience is people who are really about DBT and how you help bring your people along on that journey, right? And
Yeah.
I love that you've got people who are sharing this podcast with their people so that
Hmm.
people can be learning DBT that way. But also it's like
Hmm.
what is their, like you said, what's their modality? What's the way that they like to learn?
Yeah.
Anyway, another.
Yeah. I will also plug real quick. I did subscribe to the DBT Insider. And so I've
Oh,
gotten some of your emails, and let me tell you, they are incredibly thorough. I mean, there's so much information packed into those emails. And so, yeah, when you do get that email, if people do sign up, it is enough content to honestly keep you going for like the week to come.
I
There's
thought
quotes in there. It's like there's talking about like academic articles. Like, I mean, you cover everything when it
I
comes
was
to
like,
a
for
skill.
people who like are like, oh my God, that's gonna fire off my amygdala. I'm like, read the quotes, listen to the
Yeah,
meditation. You know
scroll
what I mean?
through it and pick something
Pick
because
something.
it has,
Don't feel
again,
like you
something
gotta
for
take it
everybody.
all in, right?
Yeah.
Like pick whatever
Mhm.
feels like it speaks to whatever you're going through right now.
Yeah. Or like for me, like when I first scroll through one, I didn't have a lot of time. So I was like,
Yeah.
oh, look, Diana's email, our future podcast guest. Okay, let me click on this. And I did not have a lot of time. So I was kind of like, I was scrolling and I was like, whoa, she's got a lot of stuff. Oh my gosh. Wow. She puts a lot of time into this. Like that was my initial unfiltered reaction. But it's one of those things where it's like you don't have to read through it right then and there is what I told myself. So it's like it's something you can put a little star next to, come back to. Like again, all those people out there who are really wanting to start incorporating a regular DBT practice into their life. Like you just need something, whether again it could be Diana's email or it could be any book or like whatever it is, but like something where you just kind of I just realized I was about to use a word you used earlier that will anchor you to just like, okay, maybe before I go to bed, I reopen up my email and I look at it a little bit again. That's at least what I realized what would work for me rather than pressure myself like, oh my gosh, I need to read this all right now. No, you don't. Like an email doesn't go anywhere. Come
I
back.
mean, there's images, right? You could be like, okay, I'm gonna pick one little thing to read, or I'm going to do
Mhm.
one of the meditations. I have all these meditations on the Insight Timer that all relate to DBT skills. Whole other thing as well. And the newsletter features one of those every time. So
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing. So I'm just looking at our time here that we have for today. So unless there's anything last minute that you want to share, Diana, I mean, all the stuff we talked about today we're going to be posting about in our Facebook group, and also we'll be putting links in the show notes. So if you want to order Diana's book, if you want to go check out her webinars, if you want to find her podcast, it's all going to be out there to click on. But are there any other things that you really want to make sure our listeners know about before we move into closing moment and start wrapping things up?
I guess I just really hope that your listeners are clear about how awesome it is what you're doing. I mean, I'm
Oh,
sure
thank
they
you.
are, but like just the more that I've gotten to know you, the more I've learned about what you're doing, the space that you've created on Facebook, your consistent engagement with the DBT and Me podcast for
Oh,
3 years. That's a lot of commitment and it's a lot of generosity.
thank you.
I just feel like I really respect what you're doing because I feel like creating community like this is so important. It's so important for people's DBT journey. And so I just want to say I just so respect you and so respect you and Kate for everything that you're doing. And I'm just really, really honored to be included and invited into your journey. And I just really appreciate also the opportunity to share all the stuff that I'm doing with your people. I really
Yeah.
appreciate
Yeah. Sometimes, of course, we have different topics that come up each month with what we record on. Sometimes it's listener suggested topics. Sometimes it's Kate and I drawing inspiration from our own lives. But really lately, I don't want to speak for Kate, but I think she'd honestly agree with me. Like just feeling this call to really make sure that, yeah, we're not just talking about our own things that we have out there in the world, or yeah, like our own experiences, like really making sure that we know what all is out there in the DBT community, because there is so much. And then
it.
really hand picking and finding the people and the resources that we're like, no, this really adds something of value. That's
Yeah.
why I was so interested in your book, because I was like, this isn't just another DBT workbook. There's plenty of those out there. This book is different. This book adds value.
Yeah.
This is a book that I would actually really want to recommend to people, not one that I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, it's a workbook. It could be good. No, like, so your stuff, you know, is really, really amazing. And so I'm really glad that you're here with us, and that, over, the last few months since we met you, I've gotten to know more about, yeah, what you're all about, what you're offering, so that I can come on here today and record this episode with you and really talk about it from like a genuinely heartfelt place.
I appreciate it. I feel like
Because I know it's going to be important for people listening.
I think, DBT literally saved my life. I had been, and I'm very public about this, I had been suicidal from the time I was about 5 until I was 39. And I was losing my battle, and and then I was very lucky I got referred to DBT. And so I am extremely passionate about this because
Yeah.
it saved my life. And I feel like, one thing I love about Marshall Linehan is she's like, DBT is not for everyone. It's not the be all end all for every single person. But for people who are struggling with unbearable pain, I just love connecting with people like you and Kate, who we all have this mission of helping
Mhm.
people access the skills that can really change that. It doesn't mean that you don't have pain, right?
Mhm.
I was rolling in the boil,
Yeah, that's right.
but to have tools to deal with that pain when the arrow strikes, that is a
Mhm.
big deal. It is a really, really big deal.
Yeah.
And I love what you've said. Like, I'm all about this community thing. And I love that you're like, not only have you created a community of people who are going through DBT and who are trying to learn about DBT, but that you're creating even more now community with other people who are also trying to find ways, fresh new ways to teach
Mhm.
about skills and help engage. There's so many people who need DBT, and it's
Mhm.
quite expensive. And,
Yeah.
as you know, it takes a lot of training and a lot of perseverance on the part of the therapist. And so having us all kind of work together and create more ways of helping people access the skills is just really amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. Okay. Well, we're going to dive into closing moment. I also want to apologize because I know on my end with sound today, people may have overheard at times my daughter, she just turned 6 months. She was having some moments I heard on the other side of the door in the room next to me today. So I'm going to hope that this closing moment is a quiet, peaceful one. And also, there could be background noise. And I appreciate everyone's patience and understanding around that if it crops up. But if you are able to just get settled into where you're at and closing your eyes if you feel comfortable doing so. Just starting by paying attention to your breath. Perhaps saying hello to your body. When we can get so caught up in not paying attention to it as we go through our days. For this closing moment today, Diana talked about this really powerful image of being in the boil and having the three flames of greed and hatred and delusion feed that boil that we can all get caught in from time to time. And so for today, in this moment, I want you to begin by picturing a pot over some flames. Maybe you imagine yourself standing at your stove in your kitchen. Or maybe you see yourself somewhere out in nature with a bonfire, almost like a cauldron over the flames. Whatever it is, just start to form an image of what this pot looks like, what these flames look like. And now adding to this pot two things. First, pouring in some water, seeing the pot fill up. And next, bringing to mind an object that represents a situation in your life that is currently causing you stress and overwhelm. Thinking about some physical, tangible item that represents all of that stress you feel and putting it into the pot with that water over these flames. And imagining the water starting to boil. And as you see this before you, you may start to notice some shifts in how your body physically feels watching this take place. You might feel a little more tense, or your heart might be beating a little faster, might feel a little warmer. It likely feels a little stressful to be watching this boil taking place. And as you're watching it and sitting with it, start to get curious about those three flames. Asking yourself, am I experiencing greed about this situation? Is there something that I'm wishing was different about it? Am I experiencing hatred? Strongly disliking, hating what is currently happening here? And am I experiencing delusion? Are there parts of this situation that I do not want to look at or face? And really taking in how the suffering of all of those things feels in this moment. Because we are about to consciously free you from those flames. So when you're ready, picture yourself removing the pot off of the flames and taking it as far as you need to really give yourself some space. You might even imagine yourself turning around to see the flames, knowing that they are back there. You don't need to feed them anymore. And notice as you do this, what happens within your pot. How the water starts to simmer down. You may even want to pause here for yourself and take in a breath or two, really letting your breathing deepen. And when you feel ready, when it feels like the water has cooled and it's safe to do so, reach into your pot and take out that object that you put in there. Notice if it looks or feels any different to you now. And take a moment to ask your wise mind, what do I do next? Do I set the object down and walk away? Do I hold it closer? Whatever feels right, whatever your wise mind tells you to do with it. Just taking some time to do that next step now. Free of greed, free of hatred, free of delusion. And when you feel ready, start to bring our attention back to the space that you're in, bringing some gentle movement to your body. And opening up your eyes when you feel ready. Thank you again, Diana, for being a wonderful guest. And thank you, everyone, for being here.
To learn more about us and the DBT skills we're teaching each week, join our Facebook group. Simply log in to your Facebook profile and search for DBT and Me podcast.